mentioned, we're going to talk about the COVID vaccines. And the question is this the correct step, the right answer, the magic wand, the silver bullet, whatever you want to call it right now, for the COVID epidemic that we're all suffering from? So that's what we'll look at. And as mentioned, I'm from a business background. I look at innovation, and in particular, I'd like to look at the COVID vaccines from the point of view of innovation itself, and also from a strategic perspective. By the way, I do have a blog which you can read at rajivsrinivasan.substack.com, and I welcome you to subscribe to that, because I've already done a couple of podcasts on this very topic there. So I'll try to expand on the ideas that we discussed there. And we're doing this today on November the 30th, the last day of November. We're going to go with the information that we have as of today. What we know is that there seems to be this definite effort in India to do something that replicates what we did with pulse polio. As you remember, a few years ago, every child in the country below 5 had been given pulse polio vaccine several times. Right, I forgot how many, but this was a gigantic effort, right, all over the place, in railway stations, airports, everywhere. You had hundreds and thousands of medical people providing pulse polio vaccines to children, and it was a huge success. I can tell that today the same kind of effort is being put in place. We saw, for example, the Prime Minister went to 3 different vaccine facilities on Saturday. He visited, I think, Serum Institute, he visited a couple of others, and there have been a number of news items talking about how the cold chain is being revived. So I think it's absolutely, if not certain, very likely that we will have the cold chain revived, and we'll be doing mass vaccination in India. And so let's assume that that's going to happen and look at what the consequences, etc., are. And why are we doing this now? Because it's very evident that there are lots of deaths. You can see the blue lines, which are in North America and the European Union. Those are growing, again, alarmingly. The Indian picture, which is most of what is South Asia, is the pink line. That's also not looking that great. We had a reduction, now it's gone back. So people are dying. This is really not a good thing, and obviously this is something we need to do something about. So that's why there is this great urgency to bring this vaccine out. The question, though, is that even though we can all accept that vaccination is a perfectly genuine, perfectly reasonable option as far as the medical community is concerned, there are several questions that we look at. Okay, one is the science, and let's take a brief look at that as we go forward. Second is, very importantly, what are the ethics of using the vaccine now? And let's not forget the cost. Okay, nothing comes free. It'd be easy for us to say, let's go vaccinate everybody in the country, but what is the opportunity cost? And then there is the question of how on earth do you deploy it? It's a gigantic exercise in logistics. And there is a root cause issue. Are we jumping into this vaccine without due thought or due consideration simply because this is what the Western establishment is telling us? And if that is the case, and I'm afraid it may well be, it's an arguable question, then we have to be a little bit skeptical about it, and I am being skeptical about it. So that's what the tone of this presentation is going to be. It's a strategic question. It's question of why are we doing this now? What are the options that we have, etc. So science and technology. I would say that the main thing that we're looking to do is to reduce the number of infections. And for that, we need to obviously increase the immunity of people out there. There are many things that we can do to increase immunity. The first thing that all of us have been doing is isolation. Second is there have been efforts to take existing drugs such as hydroxychloroquine or new drugs such as remdesivir and favipiravir, etc., and try them on this coronavirus, the Wuhan coronavirus. None of them has been all that brilliant success, although there have been quite a few anecdotal reports, friends of mine who have, as doctors, who have been quite successful in using, for example, hydroxychloroquine and some others. And I'm talking about people in India, Bombay, and Bangalore who've been successful in using remdesivir. So there are some drugs out there, although the WHO recently said that in their solidarity trials, they found that almost no drug was particularly efficacious. Then the question, the main thing that we're talking about is, can we bring out some new vaccines for the world? There are also repurposed vaccines. There have been several efforts. For example, there is something called, I believe, ivermectin. Then there is BCG and several other vaccines that have been useful for other things. Even for leprosy, there is a Professor Govardhan Das, who is a well-known authority in this field, and he has been suggesting the use of, for example, leprosy vaccines for COVID. I'm not quite sure how far we've gone with that. Not very far, I think. But there's one other option that we've not really talked about a lot, which is, can we have very cheap paper tests, which may cost something, I don't know, along the lines of ₹1 each? And can we just give, booklets of these people so that they can test themselves on a very frequent basis, maybe every couple of days? And even if the tests are not exceptionally good, they may have some false positives, they may have some false negatives, but the fact that they're so inexpensive and that you can test yourself repeatedly, and you can test yourself after you suspect you've been infected or exposed, etc., that might be another way. And there are several such efforts that have been going on in India. I'm aware of one from the Sri Chitra Institute in Trivandrum, which is where I live, where they have identified a quick and cheap test. But the ones that I'm talking about are really, extremely cheap. I think they could be produced for like ₹1 each, and they'll be basically paper, right? It's like pregnancy tests or something. You use your body fluids, like from your nose, a swab, and if the color turns blue, well, you are positive, and otherwise you're not, something like that. So there is a whole plethora, there is a whole universe of answers to this coronavirus problem right now. Vaccines are not the only ones. Somehow there seems to be this belief that we have to do vaccines and that's all that's available to us. I don't think so. So we've got to consider these other things. But once you move forward and look at the vaccine, let's understand what vaccination is. The technology is really very old. It is documented from the 1700s. Vaidyas in eastern India knew that vaccination was beneficial, and they practiced it. Unfortunately, the British, as they have often done, they said, oh, this is barbaric, it's a barbaric practice, so they banned it. And then, lo and behold, their guy, Edward Jenner, discovered it or invented it, and suddenly it became good practice. And here I have an example of a document that was a letter written by a fellow named Robert Coates from India to his friend, who was a doctor in the UK in 1731, and this is quoted in the famous Dharampal series of books, which, by the way, I recommend highly. Everybody who's watching this, I suggest to you, please go and read these books. They're available on the net free of charge. So, as I was saying a minute ago, what is it that we really want? We want to improve our immunity. This can be done quite inexpensively and easily with a number of steps that are already available, well known. You could use several herbs. For example, you could use turmeric, garlic, ginger, etc., and other natural preparations. You could use yoga and certainly pranayama, because this is something that affects your nasal cavities and your lungs. You could also use nasyam, I believe it's called, whereby you insert some aromatic oils, some medicinal oils into your nose, and all these will help reduce your viral load. And if you can reduce your viral load in your nasal passages, and then you can reduce it in your throat by doing frequent gargling with hot water and salt, or with something like betadine, the chances are that you're going to be able to reduces the load to a certain level beyond which or below which the virus is not going to get into your lungs. So that's one thing you could do. And this is something that lots of people, I mean, I'm doing this myself, and many people are doing it. But we want a vaccine because it's quick and easy and apparently effortless. There are several kinds of vaccines, traditional vaccines that use viral vectors, and then mRNA vaccines, and we'll talk about them a little bit. But once we look at vaccines, I also want to emphasize that the science is relatively untested. And vaccines clearly do immunity boosting, right? It helps the system to create antibodies so that antigens, for example, this particular pathogen, or to be precise, the spike proteins on its surface which latch on to a normal cell, will be recognized by the immune system, and the antibodies will go ahead and destroy it. Now, vaccines are of three types. The first is the traditional type, which uses an attenuated or dead virus, which is recognized by the body's immune system, which then produces the antibodies. The second is vector-based, whereby a neutral virus is used as a carrier. And in general, they seem to use a class of viruses called adenoviruses, which seem to inhabit the nasal passages. And these can be made to carry a little bit of the specific target vaccine's proteins, which then sensitizes the immune system to those proteins and therefore to the virus itself. So this is what, for example, is used in the AstraZeneca or Oxford virus. It uses a chimpanzee adenovirus as a carrier, a neutral carrier. The third is the mRNA-based vaccines. Now, this is where we have very, very new science. What mRNA is messenger RNA, which has been synthesized, that is inserted into the body, and it instructs cells to produce a protein, which is one of the proteins on the COVID virus surface. And once that protein is created inside the cell, you find that it's able to induce the creation of antibodies, which will then send out the real virus. So there are three different mechanisms for viruses. mRNA is very, very new. This gives you a little bit more of a picture of what I just described. On the first half, you see how this RNA, the squiggly thing, is the messenger RNA that is being presented to the cell, and that cell creates the memory in the cell that remembers this particular antigen based on the squiggle that it has been presented. And when a real pathogen comes, it recognizes the antigen, and there is a massive response. So that's the theory behind mRNA. It sounds really good, and it's really interesting theory. Unfortunately, the problem is that what I've emphasized here, there is no mRNA product that has ever been approved by regulators. To me, that is a big flashing danger signal. Okay, it's new stuff. As a person who does innovation or studies innovation, I know that there are disruptive innovations that come around periodically that change the playing field altogether. They make tremendous improvements to people's lives, etc. But the problem here and in disruptive innovation is sometimes you have no idea of the side effects or the ways in which the innovation changes things. Okay? So that is a concern. Now, this is there is a specific issue here. See, the mRNA is a synthetic messenger RNA that's induced into the cell. What if something goes wrong? Now, recently, I talked also about CRISPR. CRISPR-Cas9 is this essentially miraculous technology that can do very precise gene editing. However, even that has been shown to have occasional side effects or unintended consequences. I mean, you may remember this. This is what got two women scientists this year's Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. They got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry this year for CRISPR-Cas9. But even that is not 100% safe. So I have some concerns about simply believing that mRNA is completely safe and there are no issues that we can anticipate. I think there will be issues. So today's vaccines, as I mentioned, Pfizer is mRNA based, Moderna is also mRNA based, AstraZeneca is not mRNA based. And there is an interesting difference on the deployability, because distributing the vaccine is a huge problem. And again, this is something we always talk about in business school when we look at something new. It may be a brilliantly engineered product, it may be highly manufacturable, but is it distributable? Can you get it to the customer? Here, if you look at Pfizer, it is supposedly 95% safe, but it needs to be maintained at minus 70 degrees Celsius, and that's very, very difficult. Moderna needs to be maintained at minus 20 degrees Celsius, but it can also be stored briefly at minus 8 to minus 2. And why is that interesting? Minus 8 to minus 2 is a normal refrigerator. So you can keep a vaccine going at that temperature. That means your normal cold chain will suffice. You don't need anything extraordinary. Now, that is absolutely true of AstraZeneca. It doesn't require deep freezing beyond it. And furthermore, the partner that is the manufacturer, Serum Institute of India, has already manufactured 40 million units. So that's a big positive as far as this vaccine is concerned. I also have been hearing about how Imperial College in London, currently in late trials, has a self-replicating mRNA, which means that you could give a much smaller dose initially because it will replicate itself. Now, this also has some downsides. If something goes wrong, that's going to be multiplied rapidly as well. Now, having said all this, I want to emphasize that I'm not one of those people who's anti-vaccine, because there are some people who are fundamentally against vaccine, but I'm not. I think there are many that have been proved quite effective. The polio vaccine was introduced by Jonas Salk in 1951. So, and several other vaccines, BCG, the shots that you take against smallpox when you're a child, etc., they have been shown to be extremely effective. So there's no question that vaccines are available that have been very, very useful. The question is about the particular vaccines that are in the offing right now. So let's be very clear about that. There are a whole bunch of question marks. The first one is, let's say you get a jab or two, because typically these are 2 doses. How long will you be immune? The fact is that nobody knows. And if you look at some other vaccines, for example, the flu vaccines, this is an annuity for the drug companies. You got to have a jab every year. Isn't that nice? Because that means you get money from people year after year after year. Now, the second question is, what if there are plenty of mutations, and that's in fact why the flu jab needs to be done every year. mRNA, incidentally, is a good technology because you can easily synthesize a new messenger RNA for the new mutation. So you should be able to pivot rather quickly. That's a good thing about it. There's another question. You may be immune as a result of the vaccine that you have taken, but can you still be a carrier? I mean, I'm not even talking about asymptomatic. You may be symptomatic, you may not be symptomatic, but will you be still a carrier? Will you be infectious? Can you give it to somebody? Unfortunately, nobody knows the answer to that question either. So there are a whole lot of questions. As I mentioned already, there's 90% efficiency, 95% efficacy, etc., have been reported in the FDA trials. Now, these FDA trials, typically the Food and Drug Administration trials, consist of 3 phases after the preclinical trial. The preclinical trials are done on animals, but then you have small human trials, medium-sized, say a few hundred or so humans, and then large human trials, which may be tens of thousands. So I believe here it was something of the order of about 50,000, 43,000 is what I remember. But there are some questions about that. Now, if you're doing these trials in the West, are your subjects representative enough? Or are they mostly European or American or white people? Are they mostly men? Are they young, old? What is the sampling process you've gone through, and why should we believe that that's going to be representative? Can you extrapolate your results to everybody on Earth? India, in fact, is rather unique. It has many different genetic characteristics that are, for example, the RNA genotype or mitochondrial DNA. India seems to have the oldest version, for example. So, can you say with some confidence that tests in Europe will suffice for India? Maybe, maybe not. But in any case, these test results are still closely guarded. They're not public, they're not peer reviewed. And then the other question, there is this gold standard in medicine called RCT, or randomized controlled trials. That has not been done. Okay, so why not? Now, I personally have concerns about RCTs in general, but they have not been done. And there is this very peculiar result from AstraZeneca when they injected people with 2 full doses. The efficacy was 62%. But when they injected people with a half dose and then a full dose, accidentally it turns out, then the efficacy went up to 90%. Now, this doesn't sound to me like something that is easily explicable. So there are any number of questions about the results of the clinical trials. And until and unless experts go through them, we will not be able to say that the results are satisfactory. My other big question is about the side effects and also, incidentally, about fraud. And I'm not saying that people are being fraudulent, but there is a general tendency in the biomedical world for frauds, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I've been observing that several trials were stopped and then they were restarted because there were side effects reported. Some were serious enough that people were unable to go to work. They reported soreness and muscle pain, fatigue, and so forth. But let me also say that these trials have been restarted. But there have been concerns in the past about very, very severe side effects. So an example is the MMR, mumps, measles, rubella vaccine, which is widely used. Some years ago, in 2011, there was a paper by a fellow named Andrew Wakefield in the Lancet. By the way, the Lancet is probably the most prestigious publication in the medical world. And according to that paper, MMR was causing autism in children. Obviously, this is a big deal. And that led to tremendous anti-vaccine sentiment. And then a couple of years later, I think 2013 or 2014, it turned out that the paper was complete fraud. Okay, so sometimes you wonder, can you trust what's coming in these medical journals? And in particular, there was a huge problem in May this year in the same Lancet and another highly prestigious journal called the New England Journal, NEJM, New England Journal of Medicine, about hydroxychloroquine. There was a company called Surgisphere, and according to their results, which they claimed were based on 100,000 people in hospitals all over the world, they found that hydroxychloroquine was positively harmful and negative. And this caused a fuss, a kerfuffle, a furore, because everybody said, oh, wait, HCQ is so bad, Surgisphere has found out. But then, when it was investigated, it was very clear that this company, Surgisphere, unfortunately it was run by an Indian American person, a doctor, it had fabricated the data. There was no data. It was complete egg on Lancet's and New England Journal of Medicine's face. But this is the level of fabrication of data. It's not clear who benefited from it and therefore who did it. But there are these problems with fraud on a large scale in the biomedical world. So that makes people like me, somebody who's a potential user of their products, really nervous and leery about what's in the works. And we also find that the institutions that should be the ones taking care of us, such as the World Health Organization, are being gulled. They're being made to look ridiculous. And here's what they said. Maybe we should have asked for the database. Yeah, you should have asked for the database, but you didn't. And unfortunately, this is what the chief scientist of WHO, Soumya Swaminathan, obviously an Indian person, said, here's the full quote. In hindsight, you can say maybe we should have asked for the database, we should have examined it, but that's not normal, especially when it's published in the Lancet, especially when it's published in the Lancet. Isn't that ridiculous? Just because it's in some journal, you believe them? I don't think so. Trust maybe, but as good old President Reagan said, verify. Trust but verify. Okay. Also, there was an interesting coincidence. The day Pfizer and Moderna announced their new vaccines, their stocks went up dramatically. And the Pfizer CEO sold 62% of his stock on that day. Similarly, the Moderna CEO sold 40% of his stock. And the question is, yes, they say that these were pre-programmed. If the stock hits a particular price, sell. But doesn't that show a certain amount of lack of trust or lack of belief in their own products? I mean, I would think twice about that if I were one of the researchers. Vaccines. The vaccine that I believe we are considering in India is not an mRNA vaccine. Unfortunately, their data, even though it's a traditional vaccine with no mRNA risk, the data, as I mentioned a little while ago, was a little bit funny, the half dose, full dose bit. And their stock, in fact, instead of rising, plunged 6% the day it was announced. Now, the Serum Institute of India is the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world, and they are doing AstraZeneca's vaccine in India, and they have a good track record. And I was very impressed by them when they took a big risk early on, and then they ramped it up. But anyway, I was full of appreciation for the Serum Institute because they spent a whole lot of their own money. It's estimated as about $700 million, dollars. That was a risk, and I was hoping that their vaccine would be successful. But the trials that they have done have also not been without incident recently. Now, this is news as of today, November 30th. Apparently, there were some problems with their trials, and as you can read here, a person who was one of their subjects in the phase 3 trial has demanded 5 crores, saying that he had developed very serious side effects. And by the way, Serum Institute has countersued, saying that this guy was lying, and in fact, he was probably defaming them. I don't know the truth of the matter, but I just wanted to point out that this is something that I just found out today. So given all this, I think the issue is, why are we doing this so rapidly? Okay. How can you, go back please, a couple of slides. How can you make haste with something that is so important? The normal FDA drug approval takes 10 to 12 years. Enormous amounts of data. Literally enough data to fill an ocean-going container, one of those truck containers. That's the amount of paper that they have to use. Okay? And the FDA vaccine approval, vaccine approval also takes a year or two. And I was reading just today something from the CEO of Merck, which is another big pharma company. He gave a talk at the Harvard Business School, and he said the fastest vaccine that was ever brought out, which is the famous MMR, we talked about that, the mumps rubella vaccine, it took 4 years. The Ebola vaccine took 5.5 years. TB vaccine took 13. Chickenpox vaccine took 28 years. HIV vaccine has not come out after 40 years. Okay, this is the track record. Given this, how should we believe that even if the regulators are, putting in tremendous effort and burning the midnight oil and so forth and doing everything in parallel to try and get this or get one of these COVID vaccines out there quickly, okay? How can we feel at least halfway comfortable that enough testing has been done? because this vaccine hasn't been around for very long. Okay, I'm imagining that, I heard that the Oxford vaccine was created in 2 days in March or April, right? So it's been around for less than 8, 9 months. Okay, why am I so concerned? Because in the past, there was this infamous case of thalidomide. That's not a vaccine, it was a drug, but it was given widely to pregnant women, and it caused havoc because what it did was it affected their unborn children. And so you had babies being born without arms, some babies without heads, all sorts of things. And it takes a while for the side effects to show up, right? So if we do this hastily, I think there is a very serious public health concern that we need to be aware of. So there are some questions about the ethics. So I think I've concluded most of the issues on the science and technology part. What about the ethics? What about the cost? And about the deployment? See, there are many issues with the supply chain. First of all, if you're going to vaccinate everybody, we'll need 14 billion doses because we got 7 billion people times 2 doses is 14 billion. Okay, are there enough bill of materials parts? There aren't. I know that for a fact. Gorilla Glass, you need very strong glass vials or vials. I forgot how it's pronounced. Syringes and other pieces of equipment. They're not available. Certainly not available in India. As we discussed earlier, is the cold chain good enough so that everybody who needs to be can be immunized? And will we have some people who are left out? I think we will. The people who get the vaccines will be people in cities in the West, and the people who do not will be villagers in India. So is that a proper thing from an ethical perspective? Secondly, once you decide to bring out the vaccine, there are questions about who should get them first. There is an obvious answer. The healthcare workers, the doctors, nurses, and other hospital staff, and the people who manage security, the police people, and paramilitary, and others. So that would be the answer. But wait, if that happens, okay, heaven forbid there is something wrong with the vaccine and there are serious side effects. That means our entire healthcare population and our security population, okay, all our doctors and nurses and our soldiers and police will all be down with the side effects. What if that happens? Because nobody has assured me, nobody can assure me that there are no side effects. So there is this second thought, maybe you shouldn't give it to the healthcare workers and the security people. Okay, then who else should be given priority? The next obvious group would be the most vulnerable people, the elderly, who are the ones who have died more than anybody else, and especially those with comorbidities. But the problem there is they are isolated, they are least likely to infect others. So then we really should be giving it to the people who are young and in the workforce who are most likely to be carriers. So is that who we need to give it to? Ethical question. In any case, what if we've got herd immunity going so that there are lots of people who are getting immune because they're getting mild doses of coronavirus and they don't even know it, and they generate the antibodies. So we found that lots and lots of people have the antibodies if you examine their blood. And then the other question is, what if we go ahead and do large-scale vaccination all over the place? But there are some groups of people who, for some reason or the other, do not get inoculated, do not get vaccinated, and they have reservoirs of coronavirus where they live. What do we do with them? And this is not purely theoretical. If you noticed a couple of weeks ago, the country of Denmark found out that in their mink population, minks are small furry animals, there were some mutations of coronavirus. And so you know what they did? They decided to wipe out, slaughter 17 million minks, okay, because minks had become a reservoir of coronavirus. What if there are humans or human populations, isolated human populations that are reservoirs of coronavirus? We couldn't possibly exterminate them, or will we? I don't know. the ethics of the coronavirus vaccine strikes again. Then there is the unfortunate question of cost. Okay, now we have to, there are people who say, never mind the cost, just vaccinate. It's a public health emergency. I see that. But everything has a cost. And these are the costs that have been, or the prices that have been bandied about in the media. $40 for Pfizer, $20 for Moderna, $3 to $8 for AstraZeneca. Now, Serum Institute had mentioned some time ago that it would cost 80,000 crores. And recently it said that it cost under 100 or under 1,000 per person. Now, let's say they give a break to the Indian government and let's say they charge 550 doses, but then the logistics also costs, say, another 500 rupees. So that means 1,000 rupees total cost, okay, to vaccinate 1.3 billion people, and that's 1.3 trillion rupees. It's a fairly large amount of money. That's 1.3 lakh crore rupees. Do we have that kind of money to spend on something that we do not know is guaranteed to work? Remember, no vaccine has been released in 10 months of inception. No vaccine of the mRNA variety has ever been released by the authorities. And also, here is this question people always ask, what is the opportunity cost? If we didn't buy the vaccine at 1.3 million, 1.3 lakh crores, what else would we buy with that? Okay, and this is beginning to look like almost 1% of GDP. What are the other costs? What if there are huge side effect costs? What about human suffering, right? So this is beginning to start adding up, and 1 or 2% of GDP is a huge amount of money, and it's not clear that we can afford to do that. Next question. Now I want to move to my final segment because I think the root cause, unfortunately, is a tendency that we have to accept what Westerners come up with as blind solutions to ourselves. Okay? We have basically done this in a variety of instances. One is, the famous poet, the Nobel Prize winning Octavio Paz, once said about his own home country that it was condemned to modernize. It looks like we're condemned to modernize. We have abandoned all sorts of things because we're colonizing the mind. Traditional foods, education, etc., traditional medicine. Globalization is not necessarily something that is absolutely, the truth. It's something we need to look at again. We have sacrificed our traditional education on the altar of English education, and it's not clear to me that it has benefited us in any way. I'm reminded of something that the great Sri Lankan philosopher Ananda K. Coomaraswamy said, and I'm not going to read this, but it basically says that one generation of English education means that the product of that education is neither here nor there. Okay? It's somebody who is basically a lost person. And this is said by Ananda Coomaraswamy almost 100 years ago, and it's absolutely true today. We keep acting in haste and then we repent at leisure. Green revolution, wonderful thing. Yes, it increased the number of calories available. We don't have to go to the West with a begging bowl and get PL480 wheat and corn. That is true. But along with that, a lot of our traditional varieties of rice and wheat, and especially millets, the coarse grains, they've died. They've died up. They're no longer available. And by the way, some of it was biopiracy as well. And then the amount of chemical fertilizer, and also I forgot to mention here, water. We've started digging up and pumping out so much water, paleo, and this water that had been there for centuries underground, that we were seriously hurting the water table. And as India is one of the more water-stressed countries in the world, it's not a good thing. And so we've got lots of calories, but not enough nutrition. That's one of the outcomes of the green revolution. Similarly, the white revolution. Yes, there is something that looks like milk, and we think it's milk, but is it? Because it's A1 milk, which is produced by Boss Taurus Jersey cows. It's not the traditional A2 Zebu pumped cattle which we have had in this country for millennia. It's disease resistant, it's heat resistant, and so there are many concerns about the white revolution as well. And these are both things that we just blindly believed the Westerner when they said, "Oh, green revolution, try these new and enhanced varieties of rice, or this Jersey cow, etc. It is more medical, and so on." So now I think we should look again at some of these innovations with a critical eye. Here are some that I've been thinking about. Nuclear energy sounds great. Unfortunately, there's radioactive waste. The internal combustion engine, wonderful for global warming. Internet. Some of you may have seen this new documentary called Social Dilemma, which has its problems, but it really does bring out the issue that instead of being the mechanism that is going to become a creator of freedom of expression, it's now the exact opposite, based on thought control. And then there is this general concern about medicine. There is no theory of disease in allopathy, Western medicine, right? It's basically symptomatic. Okay? The only thing they have is a germ theory. Now, there are some real questions about the virus, the Wuhan coronavirus. It's affecting all kinds of body parts, the brain, the lungs, the heart, etc. Nobody knows why. Also, it's very interesting that the surface spikes on that coronavirus are very similar to HIV/AIDS proteins. Is that a natural evolution, or did somebody create that in the lab? We don't know. There are conjectures both ways. Also, we have underestimated the coronavirus because initially everybody thought it was a lung problem. So the prescription was to put anybody who had lung breathing difficulties on a ventilator. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to help. Lots of people who went on ventilators didn't really survive. Okay, that was not the right answer. So there are many things we still don't know about the coronavirus. So I'm not sure we want to be guinea pigs for Western facts. To summarize then, there are a whole lot of questions about the coronavirus, about the vaccine may or may not work, and they're being rushed to market. Who knows about the side effects? And we certainly have to step aside and not look only at the medical aspects of it. We have to look at the trade-offs. We spend this money. What are the ethics? Who do we give the vaccine to? And I'm afraid that in the final analysis, I'm deeply skeptical. I feel like we're lemmings in that old idea of just unthinkingly leaping off the edge of the cliff. We're doing something tactical because of pressures, but that doesn't really make any strategic sense. So I will conclude here, and I will go see if there are any questions that people want to ask or have already asked, and I'll be happy to answer.
So, your talk raises not one but several questions. So, I would like the permission to ask those several questions one by one. First question is, the value of medical literature that you talked about. Don't you think that the medical literature is the best we got? Yes, there are frauds, as in any profession, there are frauds, but the peer-reviewed journal at least helps you detect frauds. Subject to human limits of being able to actually find the facilities to reproduce somebody else's experiments. Don't you think there is actually plenty of credibility left in the biomedical literature, and that it actually gains more credibility precisely because these kinds of things are detected?
The question I have is, where is the data? Okay, that's the first question. The second is, there is this tendency in the biomedical literature to be statistics-based, randomized controlled trials, okay, correlation rather than causation. So I also mentioned this. What is the theory? There is no real theory of disease that we're looking at. We're simply looking at, suppose I give this medication, does the person improve? That's correlation, not causation. So there is a fundamental issue with many of the troves of data out there because it's statistics. That's one. The second is, in the case of these vaccines right now, there isn't any data that is available to experts to look at. And if they do, like for example, I was talking to this friend of mine, a doctor named Shiv Shastri. Okay, Shiv would be very happy to look at the data out there. But at the moment, we do not have the data, yet we're kind of rushing into releasing this. They're getting emergency use authorization from the FDA. And my question is, based on what? Let's see the data, let's analyze the data, and let's beat it to death. And if at the end of that, people are satisfied, I agree with you there. There are people who have been combing through the data for a long time, and they can see some patterns, and if there are questions and issues, we can bring them up. But the fact is that there isn't any data yet.
The other thing you talked about was mass vaccination. But don't you think something like vaccinating foci of infection, as was done with smallpox, would be a far more effective strategy in the case of whether it is COVID or flu or anything else? Either going for the most vulnerable groups or looking at foci in a geographical sense so that you can vaccinate everybody around particular incidents of infection and so on. I mean, is that strategy being looked at seriously or no?
Part of the group of people who's looking at it. I'm an outside observer. So far as I can tell, there is no strategy. It's basically let's vaccinate everybody. If you look at the all over the world, what they're saying is let's vaccinate as many people as possible. And there are, as I was mentioning a little while ago, there are ethical questions about do you vaccinate the medical people. That was the first thing that I heard about. Let's vaccinate all the doctors and nurses and other medical people so that at least we have them healthy so they can look after other people who are infected. So that was one strategy. The second strategy was, as I said again earlier, let's vaccinate the more vulnerable people. But all of those mechanisms have their downsides. Okay, so today I think I think there is really no strategy. They're just going to vaccinate whoever they can get their hands on. And the way the Indian government is moving by bringing that pulse polio cold chain back into action, it seems to me the plan is large-scale mass vaccination. I don't see any reason to disbelieve that. Everybody, and in fact, I've also heard in there is some discussion that you will have to have a vaccination certificate so that your Arogya Setu gives you an e-pass. And if you don't have an e-pass, you will not be able to board a plane or a train or anything like that. Now, this is at this point not official, but I believe it. How on earth do you give somebody an e-pass? Well, you produce a vaccination certificate. So if that's the case, there'll be people out there queuing to get vaccination, right? So any strategy goes out the window. Those who are well connected will get the vaccination first, etc. So trying to say, look, there is a reservoir of this in a particular geography may be a good strategy, but my point is that there doesn't seem to be any strategy at all.
You said that most of what we see is actually correlation and not causation. But the same goes for most medical discoveries. I mean, the mechanisms come much later, and all you have is an empirical correlation. And incidentally, the same kind of observation can be made about things like Ayurveda, where you have a concoction of herbs that is given for, say, jaundice. And anybody could ask you, why would I drink so many bitter alkaloids over so many days, which might potentially affect the liver, whereas jaundice eventually may go away? If you don't know the active principle, why even have it? People could make the similar kind of argument, right? So what do you say to that?
Okay, that's a different discussion. Okay, the relative merits of different schools of medicine. And I'm actually preparing myself for that discussion, which I will do on a podcast in the near future. The point is that allopathy or Western medicine is basically symptom-oriented and statistics-oriented. And that is a problem because there's no underlying theory, or at least until the Louis Pasteur theory of germs, there was no theory about the disease. Whereas at least Ayurveda has an underlying theory of disease or wellness, which is the dosha theory. Now, is that 100% correct? Are there problems with it? Of course there are problems. But my issue is that the entire pharmacopoeia, the entire randomized control trials, the entire drug discovery process is all about statistics. And, let's take a really good statistician out there. What's his name? Nicholas Taleb, the guy who did the Black Swan. Now, he says very, very cutting things about the non-reproducibility of a lot of medical research out there. And this is a fact. It's only about, in some fields, only about 30% of the results can be reproduced. So I think there is a very touching, I would say, faith in statistics, which is not really borne out by reality, because I think a significant amount of disease, is cured by the human body by itself, and it would be cured with or without medicines. The placebo effect, as is well known. In fact, there is an entire school of medicine, which is the homeopathy school of medicine, which depends, as far as I can tell, entirely on the placebo effect, right? So I'm not qualified enough, and I don't want to get into a big discussion on comparative schools of medicine, but I stand by my comment on the fact that if you depend too much on statistics, you're in trouble, because correlation, we're taught repeatedly in college, is not the same as causation. Show me the cause, which is something that is very difficult in Western medicine. Usually it's take this pill and you'll be better. Unfortunately, the pill may have some side effect somewhere else. We'll ignore that. Did it cure like, for example, you've got high blood pressure, so take this pill and your blood pressure will go down. But hey, you might die of heart disease elsewhere. That's not our problem, right? So there is this tendency, and I think it goes back, if you want to be philosophical about it, to the entire Cartesian perspective. The Cartesian perspective is very atomistic. It only looks at things in isolation. It has great difficulty looking at holistic perspectives. And that's where I think this whole issue of atomicity comes up.
Well, just one observation. The two quotes that you showed of Ananda Kumaraswamy, the second one was from Ananda Kumaraswamy, but the first one is from Swami Vivekananda, actually. So
I really honestly believe they were both from Kumaraswamy.
Mr. Srinivasan, thank you for the special presentation that you gave today. I have a question, like just in your slides that you showed, that HCQ, Lancet had published an article rubbishing HCQ as a remedy, a temporary remedy, or something that can sort of mitigate to some extent the COVID-19 or the Wuhan virus. And was that because Remicade came up with its own version of a medicine, and HCQ was largely produced by India more? So like India would be, Indian pharmaceutical companies would be gaining more money, and Western pharmaceutical companies were incurring some losses. Was it a hit job done? Number one. Number two is about the China Wuhan virus. Now all over the world there is a second wave of acceleration of the virus, but whereas China seems to be very much not affected by it, everything is going smooth is what we hear, but of course the media doesn't work well. That is not free in China, but assuming that all is fine there, and China had said that it is coming up with some vaccine, or it has already produced some vaccine, or so was it something? And there are also reports saying that this virus was produced by China in its labs. So is this a kind of an economic sort of an onslaught, or for dumping all making the world dependent on Chinese vaccines or medicines? That's something, a virus that it has produced in lab, and it already has some solution for it, and would make us all be in a beeline for it.
Let me take them one by one. The first question about hydroxychloroquine versus other drugs. Now, I have no way of knowing the truth about why they did it, but here is a very small factoid. Hydroxychloroquine is an off-patent drug, which means nobody makes any money by manufacturing and selling it. And the price of hydroxychloroquine in India is 6 rupees for a 250 milligram pill. Okay, nobody makes money on it. But other medicines, and I'm not picking on any in particular, are patented drugs, which means that the pharma companies that have brought them out have a monetary interest in that. Now, I don't know if that's the only reason. There are several other reasons. For example, it turned out that President Donald Trump was a fan of HCQ, and that was in itself a good reason for a lot of people to dump on HCQ, right? And my friends who have used HCQ have told me that, the doctors who have prescribed that, they have told me, at least from anecdotal evidence, they found that it was given to people early on, the first 2 or 3 days of the infection, along with azithromycin and zinc. It had a pretty salutary effect on them. Okay, and there are stories from this Russian guy whose name I forget, a doctor in New York. He said he had 300 patients and he lost just one of them, and all he used was HCQ. So at least from that perspective, I think that HCQ was something that may or may not have been a reasonable choice, but it was certainly put down by various people for whatever reasons I wouldn't know, but I can only conjecture. Second, the question of how come East Asians are surprisingly immune to it? It's not only China, but Vietnam. It's kind of interesting because Vietnam shares a long border with China, and for the longest time they had 0 deaths. I think recently they had a few. And I was actually planning to go to Vietnam early part of this year in April. I canceled everything. And my friends who were there were telling me, hey, you could have actually come and nothing would have happened. Maybe there is some, genetic reason, or maybe it's the fact that a lot of East Asians anyway wear masks. If you go to Japan, which I did last year, everybody wears a mask all the time. They're incredibly and even paranoid level concerned about cleanliness. Maybe all that helped them, I don't know. But there is certainly a broad swathe of countries in East Asia that are, Korea also, that are relatively new. Now, I don't know why that is. I have my own conjectures. And you asked this question about whether I think this was a lab-created virus. I think there are many reasons to think it may have been, but there are equally good reasons to think it wasn't, so we don't know yet. There was a very good paper that came out of IIT Delhi in January. Can I say very good? I'm not an expert in that field, but that paper said something remarkable. It said that the spike proteins on the surface of the Wuhan coronavirus seemed very similar to HIV/AIDS spike proteins on the HIV/AIDS virus, and that's a very, it's a very remarkably good agent in terms of latching on to other cells, normal cells, and propagating itself. So they asked this question. In fact, they didn't even ask the question. They said, look, we think this is a manufactured or fabricated thing. It's not natural. Now, the result was that they were beaten up, and they were so solidly bullied online that they ended up withdrawing the paper, although the paper is out there in archives. So is there a simple answer as to whether this was something that was created by the Chinese? And why would they do that? Well, there are lots of good reasons why somebody would want to do that, because as you said, it's not only economic, it's a military threat. And you could even say, if I were Donald Trump, I could say that, hey, you got me, ejected, right? Because in the beginning of the year, Trump was doing very well, and then coronavirus came around and Trump was out of a job, right? So all kinds of things might have happened. So it's difficult, and we're getting into the realm of conspiracy theory, the conjecture about it. But I do have my own suspicions. Let me put it that way. Nobody knows categorically based on data. You can just make conjectures based on what you see.
Let's talk, Rajiv. Pankaj here. So I have one or two questions. One is on, you mentioned the data is confidential, because there are private entities involved which are developing the drug, the vaccination, and also the clinical trials. Now, as far as the IP is concerned, the patents or whatever, they always have clauses for compulsory licensing on grounds of public health and morality. So that is one possible thing which could be used. So why is there no noise about it? Confidentiality of data, vaccination, especially when the risks are so high and it's, untested, it's been rushed through and almost, being stuffed down the throat, so to speak. 1 lakh crores, your health workers or your armed forces might be impacted severely, if something goes wrong, things like that. And the other is, relating to the BCG vaccine in Portugal. Apparently, Portugal doesn't have so many corona cases or deaths, if I recall correctly. I don't know. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And the conjecture was, there was this Professor Govardhan Das who was into this kind of study, that the BCG vaccine probably has a effect to, which prevents the corona thing to spread. So the first thing is, of course, relating to IPR. And even before that, when it comes to science, especially if my definition of science, like I've been a science student all my life, right? So if you're talking about science, like let's say physics or maths, the data has to be freely available to the public, the experiment, the data, and anyone and everyone should be able to, in principle, freely access it and reproduce it or try to do that. Until then, it's not science in the first place. Okay, so science, IPR, confidentiality, and of course, another one is the BCG Portugal thing. So your views on this, please.
Pankaj, hi. By the way, sorry about our recent interaction on email. Okay, some confusion there. But anyway, taking your questions one by one, the reason the data is not available right now is the trials are not finished. Okay? The third phase of the trials are not completed yet. And by convention, once they're completed, that data should be available to researchers in the field. So that's the reason the data is available. I'm not saying the data will never be available. At the moment, it's not. Second, this issue of compulsory licensing and so forth, that doesn't rise because nobody is saying we will not allow you to use our vaccine. Nobody's saying that. They're like, hey, pay us, we'll allow you to use it, right? So that situation is not yet arising. But I agree with you. If there is a public health emergency, countries have the sovereign right to overturn intellectual property and manufacture drugs. And India has done that. There was a famous, at the moment I'm forgetting that case, that this gentleman named Kurian, who was our Controller General of Patents, he did that. He violated the patent on some drug. The third point about, I did mention Professor Govardhan Das, and he was the person who had mentioned not only the BCG, but also the leprosy vaccine, right? He had said that this might have some benefit because vaccines basically are improving your immunity, right? So the fact, early on when India was doing very well and we didn't have too many infections, one of the conjectures was that the fact that all of us take all these jabs in childhood, including BCG, may well be the reason that we had a little bit of, native immunity. But that, of course, fell by the wayside. So I've not heard this Portugal story, so I can't comment on that. But it's entirely possible that some cocktail of vaccines that you have taken in your past. Now, there are other questions. How long do these things remain? How long does immunity remain? For something like BCG, maybe it's lifetime. Okay, maybe for some others, you got to have booster shots and things like that. So It's a complicated story. And when you just look at one thing, and that's one of the issues, again, I have about a non-holistic perspective, right? If you're looking at things one by one, you might find it very difficult to unravel the impact of those things because they're going to be affected by 10 other things that you're not thinking about, right? I mean, for example, in India, the impact of dirt in our environment may actually be benign because we've been bombarded by so many pathogens all the time. Our immune systems have to be better than the immune systems of people who are living in more antiseptic climates, right? So I don't know about that specific thing. But going back to the overall issue that you mentioned about science, I agree with you. If you want to do science, you got to have the data. And I go one step further and say it's not enough to have correlation. Okay, you must have causation. You must have a theory. And this is a problem I see. Even with the coronavirus, nobody understands it. Why is this running around and affecting not only your lungs, but your brain, your blood system, and your toes, right? You get COVID toes, right? Your liver, all sorts of things. What is so special about it? Why isn't anybody telling us? Where are the researchers? So there is no theory. So that's why I'm very concerned. You're just poking at symptoms here and there, right? You poked at this symptom and you came up with this vaccine. That's wonderful. How do you know that's not going to cause something else to collapse on the other side, right? So this usually will come out only after a few months, a few years of testing. And that's why I was mentioning earlier, the MMR vaccine came out after 4.5 years. It's the fastest vaccine on record. And here we're doing something in 9 months. And out of the 9 months, I imagine that the first few months were animal trials and low-level human trials. So the real large-scale trials probably have been going on for only 3-4 weeks now. And based on that, we're going to jump into mass vaccination. To me, this isn't science, quite honestly. It's faith. You just believe. And everybody's telling us to believe. Believe that this is going to solve your problem. No. For that, you go to a religious person rather than to a scientist.
Sorry, I missed the initial part of your lecture, but nonetheless, the question which I have, you have partly answered, but let me put a different spin on it. This is about, in the eastern part of Asia and Oceania, we don't see massive spread and problems because of this Wuhan virus. You talked about Japan, and yes, I know that they wear masks all the time and all of that. But going by the common theory that if you are so protected, then once a virus hits, you will be massively going down because you have not built the immunity. Like just some time ago, you said we get bombarded with pathogens, but there it's not the case. Even places like Australia, New Zealand, and all these countries, they don't have that much issue with this virus. And New Zealand, I do not know, but Australia is like full of different people from different places, different ethnicities, and all of that. And it surprises me, at least. I don't know much about it. So I'm just putting that thing again, that what is causing these different responses?
I knew that. Right. See, this is part of where I see the lack of a theory. Okay. Do you remember that we were told to begin with that the Wuhan coronavirus was spread by touch, okay, by the virus accumulating on inanimate objects? Therefore, wash your vegetables and don't touch the elevator buttons, so on and so forth, right? So we've all gone through all kinds of jumping through hoops to do that. But now it's beginning to be, at least so far as I can tell, more and more obvious that it spreads through the air. Okay? It goes from a person who is sick, speaking or crying or shouting or whatever, right? And to somebody else who's nearby. And therefore, if you wear masks, the transmission is severely attenuated. So both people wear masks. Even if you're talking to to a person who's infected and you're within the 6 feet radius, the likelihood of you catching the disease is probably only about 5%, right? So that's where I said a culture that's mask wearing inherently may have defeated the virus because it's not allowing it to propagate. That's a possibility. And then this, if you've ever been to Japan, you notice that they're obsessed with, antiseptic this, antiseptic that, right? So masks plus there is no place where a pathogen can survive for a while. That may, and furthermore, maybe they're not in that level of proximity. I don't know. I'm not sure that the Japanese are also known for crowding themselves. Now, the other question you asked about, or the point you mentioned, is Australia and New Zealand. Well, they're islands, right? So islands may find it easy to keep all kinds of things out of their territory, right? New Zealand definitely is a very small island and sparsely populated, and that may be the reason why they've had some relatively good outcomes. But none of this is a very satisfying explanation. This is why I keep going back to this point about what is the theory of the disease of the coronavirus. Okay? Nobody has cracked that yet. We're still looking at symptoms. It pops up here, it pops up there, so we do something to fix it. You need to have a comprehensive theory about the way this thing affects you, right? And then it gets into your blood and gets into your brain and gets into your lungs and so on and so forth. So until we get there, I'm afraid that we simply have to take the most extreme perspective and say, I'm going to try and do two things. One is I'm going to try and avoid getting infected by keeping away from crowds, keeping away from any surface that is potentially contaminated, and most of all, keep away from people by avoiding close contact with anybody. So that's step number one. Step number two would be to reduce the viral load by whatever means possible. This is one of the things I said early. You could do things like Nassim in your nose, right? Medicated oils, or you could do steam inhalation daily, a couple of times steam inhalation. The idea is that even if you're infected by the virus, you don't allow the viral load to cross a critical mass. Okay, so you try to kill it off and reduce the colonies in your nasal passages, and then you do the same thing with your throat. You use gargles, right? For example, betadine gargle is supposed to be fairly good against all kinds of pathogens, right? So what you do is you progressively try to reduce the possibility of this thing getting a stranglehold or a foothold in your body. So those are the things that you can do. Now, I have no idea, as you were saying, if the Australians were particularly good about these things, the New Zealanders or the East Asians, I don't know. It could be something completely other than the factors that we looked at. And this is, I mentioned something early. I said RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, are supposedly the gold standard in drug discovery and drug production. So I don't believe that, because there you're assuming you know all the parameters of interest, and then you control for those parameters. How do you know the other parameters of interest? How do you know there are not 10 other parameters, right? So when you're dealing with this whole plethora of potential parameters and factors, right, it's very, very difficult to have just a statistical answer. You need to have a decent theory about why this is doing it. The germ theory, right, which is, it stood the test of time, is a pretty good theory. It says it's been there since very long time ago, probably 1,500 years in India, but tiny little beings that are there. So that's the only theory we have. It's not enough. We need a better theory for why this virus is so virulent, because there will be other viruses that will be even more virulent. There was the Nipah virus that killed everybody inside. There was the Ebola virus. How come we have no theories about it? For heaven's sake, we don't have a theory about the HIV virus. Okay, after 40 years. So I think there is a huge issue in there is something lacking in the theoretical side of modern medicine. In fact, this is one of the reasons I've been thinking there needs to be a hybrid kind of medicine, which is not focused on symptoms, it's focused on the individual. Because the individual is the person that matters, because you and the person next to you may be equally subjected to the coronavirus, but you may not get it and he gets it. Why? Right? What are the factors that make somebody immune to something? So there has to be a theory. This is a problem. Everything we have said today and everything that we've seen coming out of the medical establishment is basically tactical. There's nothing strategic about it. And that is a problem. And for this to be solved, I think we need to look at some kind of a hybrid of allopathy and Ayurveda, whereby you are able to create some kind of a theory of disease, specific diseases, and then figure out ways in which you can solve the problem for a person, individualized medicine, rather than take this pill because it works on 70% of the people. But what if you're one of the 30% that the pill doesn't work on, right? So I think we need to do that. That is the challenge. I think India is the country that's best positioned to do that, where we can bring both these to bear. Unfortunately, we're totally impressed by allopathy. And therefore, whatever the allopathy people say, we just blindly do. And that's what I feel we're doing now with this vaccine. I believe there is a rollout. A rollout's going to happen. All of us will be pretty much forced to go out there and get jabbed with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, I believe. Or maybe the Bharat, what was the other one? The Bharat Biotech vaccine or something. Because we're told that vaccines are the thing. So let me conclude by saying that the issue is we need better medicine. The medicine that we have today is not really satisfactory. It's symptom-oriented, and it can solve, occasionally it can solve acute things, but it hasn't been able to solve cancer, for example. It hasn't been able to solve HIV. We need to do something else.
Professor Rajiv Ji, you gave a very good overview about the factual position of the COVID vaccine and in India today. And I just want to make one small observation and a question. The observation is, as you rightly said, there has to be randomized controlled trials of medicines, and we don't know whether allopathy is allowing other systems of other indigenous systems of medicine to go for these randomized. I came across many such observations by homeopathic doctors, particularly a set of group called the othersong.com, headed by Dr. Rajan Shankaran. And he actually went through these symptoms. He's a doctor, he's a homeopathic doctor based in Pune. And in March 2020 itself, he had come out with a medicine called the Genus Epidemicus, as far as homeopathy is concerned. And he had named the medicine as Camphora 1M. And presently, it seems they have done a lot of wonderful randomized controls trials on this medicine. But the problem is, it seems in India, the whole medical fraternity works like a kind of mafia and doesn't allow any trials about Ayurvedic medicines or homeopathic in India, right? Why do you think this kind of a grip on just only allopathy? Why don't we look for other options? Why isn't the government looking for other options here?
Yeah, I mean, there is the Ayush Ministry, which is supposed to look at several of these systems of medicine. But my belief is that at the end of the day, they still are convinced that allopathy is the only thing that works. For example, there is what I called Coronil, I think, which came out of the Baba Ramdev's table. That's been immediately deprecated by everybody, right? And it's like, how could this work? Now, I got to tell you, in all honesty, I have trouble with homeopathy because I don't believe their theory of medicine, right? In the sense that I find it really hard to understand how, by diluting something over and over and over again till it's probably not existent anymore, it's just plain water, how can something become very potent? I find it hard to understand that theory. So pardon me for being a little bit negative or skeptical about homeopathy. But I believe that Ayurveda has a theory of disease which makes sense, which is that there are multiple doshas that are in constant struggle with each other. And the way something works well is if these doshas and other things are in a certain balance. And this is, for example, seen in what we have in our guts. We have good bacteria and bad bacteria in our guts, right? And if the bad bacteria are out of balance, then you're probably going to be sick. And if the good bacteria are in balance, or are if it's in balance, it's going to be better. So to me, there is some theoretical underpinning of the theory of disease in Ayurveda, which I do not see, quite honestly, in homeopathy or in allopathy. Allopathy doesn't have anything. Allopathy just says, oh, you have a symptom, here's a solution. So what is the answer? This goes back to what I was saying a little while ago. We need to evolve a holistic system of medicine, which definitely includes some theory of disease, right? And elements of allopathy, for example. Allopathy is pretty good at measuring all kinds of things. So that's definitely something that we should be able to use. For example, we should be able to use artificial intelligence. So one of the problems, or one of the good things that I see about Vaidyas is that they sit down and talk to you. They ask you a lot of questions, not only about yourself, but your family, your background, the stress levels, all sorts of things. Now, they're not making chit-chat. This is done with the idea of creating a holistic picture of you. Now, this is also something that can be done by an AI assistant, which means that you can have, Ayurvedic Vaidyas become more efficient because they should be able to see a lot more patients. Okay, because today they can't do that because they have to spend an hour with each person. That immediately limits the number of people we can see. But if we have an AI assistant, we should be able to do that more efficiently. So like this, there might be mechanisms whereby you can bring this idea of individualized medicine and technical tools to bear on coming up with really what is a large theory of medicine that incorporates various things. And maybe Homeo has a role there as well. As I was saying, I'm personally skeptical because to me, Homeo appears to be mostly about the placebo effect. You believe that you're going to get better and therefore get better. This is something that I used to go to this ancient doctor when I was a kid. And what he used to do is he used to make us go to his compounder, another ancient guy who would make this absolutely vile thing. And it was mostly based on some, I don't know what it was, something that made you, it was disgusting to eat it or drink it, right? And my belief is that your body said, please don't force me to consume this stuff, I'll get better, right? That's the way I thought it was. So, but how did we all get better? Because we believed that doctor. And not only that, your body can generally get better by itself in many cases, not all, or maybe not even the majority of cases, but a lot of small things, right? You'll just get better. You have a fever. If you take medicine, you'll get better in 5 days. If you don't take medicine, you'll probably get better in 7 days, right? Because your body knows how to take care of itself. So long as your mind thinks it can take care of itself, right? So that's what I think is the need here.